Hello everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute. Hopefully this is working. I'll get heads up from Brittany to see if it is. But yeah, today we're talking about illustration. It is my favorite lecture because I worked on this lecture and I really like it. And I'm very excited about today. But before that, we do have some big announcements to talk about. Specifically, the final is getting introduced today. So yeah, I think we'll just get started. We, hopefully the projector issue for those of you attending in person is resolved now. So hopefully they will not turn off and it will be okay. But I'll be talking pretty fast today because there's a lot of content. Cool. So the attendance form for today is yelkey.com/sport, S-P-O-R-T, sport. I think that Yelkey is like getting compromised or something, where sometimes I go to yelkey.com and it's a little like screwed up. But hopefully it should be okay. If you have any issues with the form, let me know. We'll try to send the link in the chat or on Slack or something if it's not working for y'all. But it's yelkey.com/sport, S-P-O-R-T. Cool. So first things first, we are on the beginning of the final. So I know that we've kind of just come off the midterm. I know that it hasn't been a really long time, but we do want to get the final introduced to y'all as soon as possible so you have as much time as possible to work on it. As a heads up, there's no homework for weeks 10 and 11. It is just focusing on the midterm, so you have all that time in order to work on this at your own pace. We know that people have like crazy midterm schedules still, people have finals coming up and a lot of other things going on, so we just want to maximize your time to work on this project and make it something that you actually really enjoy doing. So the final, as you may have guessed or you might have already heard from us, is to basically do whatever the fuck you want. You create your own final project proposal. So the goal for the final and for the class overall is for you to discover something that you're personally interested and to use Figma as a tool to do that. We've kind of drilled that through this whole class, that we want you to be able to use Figma as kind of another thing to add to your tool belt to make your ideas and your kind of projects that you want to pursue come to life. So with this final project, we want you to see it again all the way from start to finish. We've talked about the midterm before where it had a little bit more structure. We gave you a little bit more of a prompt. In this case, we've seen that you're able to do that. We want to see you come up with this idea from the very start. At those beginning stages, think about user research, think about user testing, think about what is a problem or what is a need that you want to solve for yourself or for other people, and see that all the way through into a completed product. Now, we don't mean this has to be like your magnum opus, like the best thing you've ever done in your whole life. Like, we're not expecting that. You took a single 12-week class, and we know that you have a lot of other things going on, which is not to say this is not an important thing, but we also want to make sure that you're able to realistically scope out a project that you feel like you can do over the course of the next month. So the requirements that we do actually include are to incorporate at least 2 of these 4 main skills that we've covered throughout the course, which are auto layout, variants, prototyping, and illustration, which we're going to cover today. So with that, I'll kind of talk a little bit about what we kind of mean by each of these. So in week 7, we talked about auto layout. This is a pretty tricky concept to grasp, and the reality is that a lot of good design work that you see going forward uses auto layout, and it makes things a lot cleaner and a lot quicker once you get used to actually incorporating it into your designs. So we want to be able to see you create work that is responsive, work that is clean and organized and neat, and something that is really ideal for something like an app or a website that really needs to be at different sizes, at different shapes all the time. So auto layout is, I think, one of the most applicable skills if you're thinking about doing a UI career or if you're thinking about doing product design in the future. I would highly, highly recommend that you pursue auto layout in this final project, even if it's not a huge part of it, in order to kind of get comfortable with it. It's something that I wish I had honestly done in the past as well. Variants, we talked about starting in week 3, that idea of components, and we built on it in the future. Variants are something that is a little bit tricky to grasp as well. All 4 of these different concepts are a little bit, more advanced, something that we've covered past the first 5 weeks. So with variants, we want to see this idea of how you can make things modular, this idea of how you can swap things out, make them work, make something really interactive and customizable in a way, sort of. So with variants, you can see a lot of really interesting ideas pop up. A lot of them can be cool illustrations where you have these swappable pieces, which you got to see or are going to see. This week's lab, this idea of like an avatar maker, like a meme maker. Or with variants, you can have really practical use cases like an app, something that has a lot of different moving parts and moving pieces that you want to keep streamlined and organized throughout the entirety of your project. The third is prototyping. So we saw prototyping last week. Hopefully you enjoyed the homework in the lab we had. And with prototyping, there's a lot of honestly huge updates that have made Figma even more powerful for prototyping. Like for example, interactive components. If you ever want to do something that relates between variants and prototyping, say you pick those two, we'd strongly encourage you to explore interactive components. In fact, I'm just gonna go ahead and show you this really cool thing that somebody made today. Figma.com/@Emily. So this is Emily, this is one of our good friends, we've mentioned her before, and she made this actual crossword puzzle completely in Figma as a prototype. So she's used interactive components in this file as a way to literally type into this particular crossword. So if you see here, when I hover over something, I can press a letter and it just switches to whatever letter I'm on. I can delete it and then I can kind of navigate this whole crossword however I want and go through the entire thing. And this is a single frame on Figma. This is one frame with a lot of interactive components on it. So that's one example, really quick, of a way that you can have prototyping and variants related through components. And finally, illustration. Obviously, we're going to talk about that today. There's a lot to dive into. I'll be talking about kind of the beginnings of art theory and like design theory and ways that you can do things like composition and perspective. So if you have no experience in illustration, this is a great place to try it. I give very thorough feedback on all of these finals, and I'm really excited to see the kind of work that y'all get to do. And this is hopefully a relatively low pressure environment. For the most part, we don't want to see you we don't want to see anyone fail this class. We're gonna do everything we can to make sure everyone succeeds and that everyone does something that they feel happy with. So any of these skills that you want to explore, if you're interested in it, I hope that you do it. It doesn't mean that you have to choose like the easiest way out, just something that you find is the most engaging to you. Cool. Any questions about what these 4 skills are? Awesome. Cool. So the first part of this final, of which there are a couple basic sections, is the proposal. So your idea for what your final is going to be due not actually Friday. This is kind of a soft deadline. The hard deadline is Monday. So the proposal is not super long. We just want to make sure that you are going in with an idea of what you want to do. So these are due hard deadline by Monday, in which case you'll get feedback no later than Wednesday, but we strongly encourage you to send them in by Friday, which means that we can give you feedback over the weekend, and then you can start no later than Monday. It just gives you a little bit of extra time. It also gives the staff a little bit more breathing room if you have the whole weekend to give you more thorough feedback. And in this proposal, you have to include your project idea and description, just kind of an overview of what you want to do. You can think about how we structured the prompt of the midterm with all of these really discrete guidelines about what you have to accomplish. You want to do the same thing for your own proposal, not because like it has to be super, super strict or super, super aligned. We just want to make sure you have a good idea of what you're doing, what you're aiming for. This can change through your process. This is just a way to get yourself aligned. So with that, the idea, your selected skill concentration. So of these 4, which 2 or 3, or if you want to try all of them, do you want to focus on? If you pick 2, or if you pick more than 2, we'd like you to indicate the 2 that you want to focus the most on, as we'll be grading the most heavily on how you implement those 2. So if you end up doing like auto layout and variants, but you want to do a little bit of prototyping, totally fine. We encourage that. And then you also want to include a goal for your midpoint through the project. So this midpoint check-in is during week 11. We're going to request that you actually submit this project. Does not have to be done, it just has to be started. We want to see where you are, and we want to do this as a way to also just help you balance out your time over the next couple of weeks. If you realistically know like, hey, I can't start the final until week 11, that's okay. Just in your midpoint check-in goal, indicate that you like have mentally figured out when you have time. This is just to encourage good scheduling because everyone on the staff has shit scheduling, so we just want to make sure everyone is doing better. This is also a way for us to guarantee that you're going to get feedback on your work. We are going to have a midpoint critique, but we also want like staff to have an opportunity to share any comments that they have, especially since it's your TAs who have been with you this entire semester. They can give you a little bit more insight about what to do, and also a lot of the TAs have done this final before. They've either done it or seen finals, so we have a little bit more to give you there. Cool. Another heads up is that after this midpoint check-in, between weeks 11 and 12 is Thanksgiving break. So we have 1 week of no class. We want to schedule it out in a way so that you don't have to do work over break. Like, we're not factoring in the like days of Thanksgiving break as days you have to do work. But just as a heads up, there's going to be like the last real lecture and then a week break and then our final presentations. So yeah. The submission, same idea as before. There's a Figma file and a write-up. The write-up, again, is also 300 words, and the link needs to be included in the write-up. We're also including a very short form just to let us know, like, hey, do you want to present at the final presentation? Because last semester we just forgot to do that and we DM'd everyone. So please, for the love of God, fill out that form so that we can know if you're going to be presenting during the lecture the next day. And also, these presentations are very low pressure. They're like 2 to 3 minutes just to like walk through your project and chat through it. We're not grading your presentation. We just really want y'all to see what everyone's been working on and give you a chance to do that. So any questions about the final? Awesome. So as a heads up, you can find the final. It's live now on our website under course content, final project. This is a very hefty document because we wanted to be super thorough about everything. Please read it all the way through. We know that it's a little bit long, but we want to be as clear as possible so you know what you have to do going into this project. Again, it's very open-ended, but we wanted to make sure that everyone has a comparable amount of work that they're doing. But yeah, please don't be scared of this. We just wanted to make it informative so you have as few questions as possible. At the end, there's just a big chunk for the timeline, so looking exactly at what the next couple weeks of the class will look like. Cool. And we really hope to see you at office hours over the next few weeks as you kind of like dive into these more difficult skills and see new things that you didn't know. So we're hoping to see you there. Okay, so now to the fun part. Illustrations, again, are today's topic. And to kind of get our brains thinking about what you can actually do as a Figma illustration, I'm going to show you a bunch of reasons to cancel your Adobe subscription. So we're starting with kind of the most basic illustrations I found on Community to the most advanced illustrations. Not to say that these are not less interesting to look at. These are really awesome illustrations and they're done very simply. So if we want to go ahead and just take a quick look into this file, we can see that it's really just a lot of basic shapes, but they've put them together in a way that looks super interesting. So if we go into this one, for example, these are all just circles or arcs that have been modified in a certain way to be shorter, to have different colors, to all have the same width and the thickness. But it creates a really cool illusion where, like, I imagine if you spun this image around, it would make you kind of dizzy. And it gives you that sense of space and almost that sense of like you're looking into a tunnel, even though it's literally just circles and arcs. If we go into another one, like say this one, they use a pretty basic shape as well. It looks to be just a really basic teardrop shape that's wider on one end and comes into a point. They added a gradient and then gave these different sizes to have a sense of depth. So you see that this like magenta one feels closer than say this really thin blue one over here. And with these really basic properties, they've created this sense of perspective and this sense of like atmosphere within this file. And so this set of vector illustrations, simple shapes, swatches of color, hundreds of circles, triangles, pen tool, shaped into nice patterns. You can animate them, you can alter them, you can take a look into this file however you want. But for the most part, you can look at this and break down all the pieces that this particular artist, Spencer Camp, used to make all these illustrations. And as we go down this list, that line is gonna be more and more blurred. So this next piece is Game Consoles and Joysticks by Noor on Community. Again, this is a piece that you can kind of understand, you know, what their mentality was when they were going into this, or the way that they were kind of approaching all these pieces. So on the right, we have these repeating patterns of the same asset over and over again. On the left, we have the asset itself. So when we look into this, let's break it down. The main Game Boy is probably just a rectangle with the border radius on this corner higher than the others. That's all they're doing there. You've got a basic cross shape. This could honestly be like the letter X that's outlined. These are two circles, two oval like pill shapes. These all look like rounded rectangles of some kind. This is a rectangle with some stripes inside of it. They could be using masking, or they could be doing it with custom vectors. And it's given this really easy sense of it being a Game Boy. Like, you look at it immediately, you're like, that's a Game Boy. I know exactly what it is. And it's really just a lot of rectangles that they put together in a way, they compose them in a way and used color in a way that you can identify what it is. It's communicating something to you through just shape, line, color. I'm going one step further. We have these tiny calculator illustrations. I just think this is so much fun. I think they're so cute. It's got a ton of these little calculators that have a little bit more detail to them. So with the others, you saw a lot of them felt very flat. There was a little bit of gradients in the first one. The second one was all flat colors. But this one, you see this kind of chrome effect that they've added, this texture that they've overlaid. So if you look here, this is an image that they've added as a textured overlay. It looks like almost some kind of leather or almost snakeskin-esque. On the edges, there's texture in addition to some kind of gradient, and it gives you that sense of it being like chrome or metal when you zoom out. You know, that sense of light actually being applied to the object. So light is going to be a huge thing that you can think about when you want to create a sense of realism in your illustrations. You've got all these awesome dials that give them the sense of depth by using inner shadows to show that, like, hey, these, I don't even know how this calculator works. I have no idea how this calculator works, but it gives you a sense of depth there, even though I don't have a mental model of what it would look like in real life. This Sea Ranch, this is a really, like, nice and lovely piece. I think it's very beautiful in how simple it is. It uses the sense of gradients. Sorry, I say sense a lot when I talk about art, but it uses these gradients really interestingly. So you know that this wall isn't actually fading into nothing, but the way that they've done the gradient makes you know that this corner is not really the important part. Your eyes are drawn to this triangle shape. You know, this main house that's being here. This palette really draws your eyes into the green really fast. This circle of the sun or the sky in the background encapsulates the whole piece really nicely. And something to note is where they've chosen to have intersections in the piece. So, for example, this tree is not perfectly aligned with the edge. It kind of covers it and it gives it a sense of depth. Up here, you have the circle not aligned exactly with the corner, as if this house is peeking out. And the sky is really like a background layer. It's not inside of the sky, it's behind it. The use of gradients here is just really simple but really powerful. They've created this shadow right here so you can give depth to this roof right here. They use it again right here, and they've used it in this chair. They have these shadows of the tree and this chair and the cactus and the building itself as well. You've got it here. And then also just a nice note is they've repeated this cloud motif in the window of the house itself and on the skylight to give you this feeling of it's daytime. You know, it's a nice time of, it's daytime, it's a time of day. It just gives you a really cohesive palette that's just really nice to look at. And honestly, also just a lot of basic shapes, lots of rectangles, lots of ovals, nothing that's a really, really complicated vector except maybe this, you know, this tree branch. Yeah. So, going to the next one, this has a lot of complicated shapes in it. There's no more to this illustration, it's just a briefcase, but I was really like impressed with what was going on in here because in this briefcase, especially when you look at it from far away, it looks super real. Like it has all these shadows, all these tiny little details that give it a sense of realism. But when you go into the file also, it's really just really clever use of gradients to make that light feel like a real light source is somewhere near you. So in order to give this shine, they've had this line gradient going all the way across. They've had that light be consistent across other things. So for example, this buckle, which is more to the right and a little higher up, has the light shining more directly on it than this buckle. You see that the briefcase gets darker as you go down. There's a shadow underneath it. It's aligned in the same way. And also something interesting is that they've used just grayscale. This artist does that quite a lot, where they have these 3D illustrations of like just stuff. And it looks awesome. It just looks so good. And it's all grayscale, but you know it has that depth to it that even though things in real life aren't technically grayscale, there's always a little bit of color to it. You know exactly what the depth they're going for is. Like, look at this. What the crap? Okay, anyways. This piece was around Twitter a lot when Soul came out. They had made this really quickly. And the most interesting part of this is that a lot of people associate vector illustration with harsh edges, but they've used blur in a way that makes this softness that you saw in Soul. If you watch the movie, you know that these are incorporeal beings. They don't actually have sharp edges at all. They're not really physical. They're not really material. And they've communicated that by having these wisps and all of these soft edges that you would associate with like maybe painting or maybe, you know, another kind of medium that isn't necessarily just hard shapes and math that isn't vectors. But if you go into this, you can kind of start understanding the way that they've used shapes to communicate light. So on this face, there's kind of this B shape that they've used to communicate the light hitting the side of the face, and then another shape here that's just these kind of blobs that they've used in order to give swatches of color, like fields of color that are blurred using the blur tool, and this nice touch of having the white outline to communicate where like the fingers on the hand are in particular, because they would get blurred out. Yeah, this is all made entirely in Figma, which I think is crazy. Next is the Monument Valley level design kit. Monument Valley was a mobile game that came out a couple of years ago and was also went kind of viral and is just a very gorgeous game. But the super interesting part of this is that this artist used variants in a really cool way. So you see, I have never actually understood how they did any of this, but you see all these different pieces. You can drag and drop them and actually manipulate this level to look like however you want. And the reality is that this is not a super complicated set of drawings where like there's a lot of really beautiful detail, obviously, but the way that they've done this is like a top-down view where they don't have to worry about all of the edges, and they don't have to worry about the way that the isometric view is going to skew this. I still to this day have no idea how they did this, but it's really cool to look at this file and explore it, and maybe you will figure it out better than I will. But they've made this level design kit that is a modular illustration, which I think is one of the most fun parts. Now, finally, this is a piece by Mr. Ham on Community, who actually did a talk at Config this year about how he approaches these beautiful illustrations. I think it is literally like so impressive. This is all done again entirely in Figma, and they've given the sense of it's a photograph or it's a painted piece. I realize that the contrast is not necessarily great on the screen, but if you go into like the hair, you see all these beautiful shine details. You see these eyes and the way that the lighting hits the nose and the side of the face. You can know it's like, oh, hey, it's harsh lighting. It's a red and a green light. You've got this reflection going on here. Even the jewelry is incredibly detailed. But the best part of this file is they made an entire progress of the whole file, and they go through every step they did to build this entire drawing. So I would highly recommend you take a look at this if you were interested in doing realism in vector illustration. I will not be able to tell you how to do all of this. Like I'm not at this level of illustration, but this person made an awesome tutorial that walks through every single step of the process. You know, how did they do this? They added, you know, all of these different masking tools. They added flat colors first. You can see, you know, trust the process. It doesn't always look incredible at the beginning, but as you go through and you add these different layers, all these different gradients, all these extra fills, you see it all come together really beautifully. So that was a little gallery of illustrations. There's a lot more on Community. You're going to see, if you go in the illustration tag, a lot of illustration sets or kind of modular things that people use for companies. But there's a lot of awesome treasures in there that I would recommend you check out. And hopefully it's got you excited, because now we'll be talking about what is illustration. You know, what is it? Why do you need to know it? Why do I care so much about this? It's very exciting. So illustration, very shortly, is visual imagery that expresses or communicates in some way. What it's actually expressing or communicating varies a lot. So here we have a book cover. We have a diagram of mitochondria. That is an illustration because it's communicating something to you. You know, what is mitochondria? It's the powerhouse of the cell. Everyone knows that. Everyone saw that in textbook at one time. You probably were able to visualize this exact cell in your head at some point between the ages of like, what, 8 and 18. Medical diagrams, another really good example of illustration that is very practical. It has a very clear thing it needs to communicate, but also that people find really aesthetically pleasing. You see a lot of like anatomical tattoos now. A lot of people like those posters at Moe's that have botanical illustrations on them. They're both practical a lot of the time and aesthetic. So they have a basically a sense of a story or some kind of communication that you see without text or that accompanies text in some way. Illustration is also not limited to a particular medium. A lot of the time you might think of colored pencils or crayons, or maybe not crayons, colored pencil, maybe pastel, maybe paint, but anything can be an illustration. You know, you can do digital illustration as well on top of everything that we've talked about. So some other examples, like here is an illustration of Shakespeare, you know, Romeo and Juliet. You are able to hear that Romeo, oh Romeo in your head when you see this illustration. You know, the emotions they're trying to convey with the color and the aesthetic of the piece. Charlotte's Web, I think book covers are one of the most interesting pieces of illustration because there's an entire book behind it. It has to sell you this book. It has to tell you what is this about really quickly and really effectively in just one image. And it probably took somebody years and years to write that book. And now they've got one illustration to communicate it to the reader. As much as we say, don't judge a book by its cover, you do. That's the whole point of having the covers. And this is J.C. Leyendecker, who I love. And I would recommend you check him out. So vector illustration, as a refresher, is not a style. It is a medium in the same sense that oil paint is a medium, in the same sense that acrylic is a medium, in the same sense that clay is a medium. Digital illustration and vectors are just a way to communicate, a way to create an illustration to tell a story. Vector illustration is basically digital or software, quote-unquote, assisted illustration. Basically, you're using some kind of tool on a computer or a mobile device in order to create it. So the principles we're going to cover today so that you can start illustrating or that you can improve your illustration skills are perspective, color, and composition. These are kind of the three main things that I think everyone needs to know if they're going into an illustration. Also to know that sometimes you can break these rules. You know the rules first if you're going to break them. There's a lot of other principles we can talk about. Like, for example, I mentioned a lot of things about light and silhouettes, but we can't really get into all of it today. This is not an illustration class. So for the students who are not as interested in illustration, we'll get through today, and that's fine. For those who are interested, I would recommend checking out other awesome decals and other resources online. So first is perspective, or sometimes a lack thereof. So perspective is how you understand three-dimensional objects in two-dimensional space. So with those pieces that we talked about earlier, let's take this one for example. They've given a sense of depth here. You know that, for example, these buildings are really far away. You know that the top of the illustration here is higher up. You know that the way that all of these different buildings and pillars interact with each other. And with Monument Valley in particular, it's especially interesting because it's a game based on optical illusions where that sense of perspective is skewed. So with perspective, sometimes, especially in vector work, you might want a certain amount of depth. Sometimes you really want it to be realistic. You know, if you're trying to do a portrait of someone, you probably want it to look realistic in depth, realistic perspective. But if you're doing an illustration, especially for vector work, you might not want it to look three-dimensional at all. You might want it to just be flat. And we could talk for hours and hours and hours about flat illustration and all of that. But the point is that that's a lack of perspective, which is totally fine. It's not a bad thing. But once you learn these rules, you can find ways to make things look really exaggerated, disorienting, realistic, whatever it is you want. So the first, the most basic thing that they would teach you in elementary school art class that you'll never actually draw ever again is one-point perspective, which means that everything converges to a single point, the vanishing point. It's a type of linear perspective where you can create a sense of depth by having clear structure that your eye is directed by. So in this example, all of these cube lines, they're not quite parallel. They all go into that vanishing point, which means that your eye implicitly knows that, hey, there's a spot that's like a horizon, just like in real life where there's a horizon line, everything almost appears to converge on a single point. So with that, you create a mental and physical model for what is far away, what is close in a 2D image. So obviously, this is all just flat color on a digital screen that you're looking at right now. But you know that this face of the cube is closer to you than this line, and is closer to you than the other face of it. You know that this is the farthest away thing, even though it's really just up and to the left, or up and to the right of the cube. So the horizontal line that the vanishing point sits on is known as the horizon line. So in this case, it is actually aligned with the illustrated horizon. So broadly speaking, the closer something is to the horizon line, the further away it is, and the smaller it is. But the further something is from the horizon line, the closer to you it is, it'll appear bigger, just like in real life. This bottle physically looks larger than Elizabeth to me right now, but obviously it's not. I just know that because I'm holding it close to me, and she is closer to the horizon, which is, you know, several miles away. It's just we're in a room right now. You can also work with 2-point perspective, where you add an additional vanishing point on the same line. So usually it's like here and here, but we're not going to get into that. You're going to see it a lot in architecture, but that's not this class. So a couple examples of 1-point perspective and some other things to think about aligned with perspective are where you put the vanishing point. So in this example, it's very obvious, or I guess it's not super obvious, but you can tell that it's going to be right in the center, just smack in the center of this painting. And a way that you can tell is you see these the lines on the column. You know that the actual hallway is going to be straight like this, but the way that they're drawn has them pointing into the center. The same happens with all these squares, where the squares are inherently pointing to the center. And then even the people are converging into the center. The people here at the front are bigger because they're closer to us. And on top of that, you know that the focus of the piece is also going to be whoever's in the center, because everything in the entire painting is drawing your eyes to that vanishing point. And I think this is a painting of philosophers. So the two in the middle, whose names I definitely don't know, are the most important ones. Extremely famous piece, I should probably know this. When you go to this piece as well, this is another kind of exaggerated example of a 1-point perspective, where this line of trees down this road is clearly converging into the single point. On this example, it's not quite in the center, it's right here. You can tell because this line makes a really nice leading line into the center. This line does as well. Even this building in the back does, and then this line here does as well. And then also the people are just situated there. Something else to note is that this follows a lot of different other rules of composition super nicely, where even though this isn't in the center, we know that, like, hey, even the dog is walking there. There's movement that brings us to the center. This example is a little less obvious. It's much further away than the edge of the room. It's somewhere back here, you know, all the way over here, because you see that the bed converges in on it, this side of the room converges in on it, it's just far away. So a second basic type of perspective is isometric. So isometric view has no foreshortening, which is that idea of like, hey, the closer it is, the bigger it is, the further it is, the smaller it is. Isometry doesn't have that, but it conveys three-dimensionality using parallel projection. So there's a really specific angle that isometric art uses in order to convey this like clear structure that you know that everything is built on. So it's like almost like building blocks. A lot of pixel art is like this. A lot of different video games you're gonna use isometric views because you want to see as much of the board, for example, as possible without losing any of that information. So the core of isometry is two sets of parallel lines that run through the entire piece in this kind of diamond grid. They form natural diamonds, and you're going to see that this is a cube, even though it is made actually of 3 diamonds because it's isometric. So this allows you to make something appear 3D without visually distorting the object. If you actually saw something that looked isometric in real life, it would be super fucked up because the things further away from you would be much larger in order to convey this. But we're able to suspend disbelief in this kind of illustration, as you can see in these, where you know that all of kind of the relative size of everything is something that's really important, where in real life you wouldn't have that. But like in this screenshot from Roller Coaster Tycoon, you can tell relatively hey, this tiny carousel is a lot smaller than the Ferris wheel, no matter how far away I put it. They feel really consistent. So if you're doing The Sims or some kind of management game, you don't want it to look like things are far away because you want to be able to see everything and control everything in that particular instance. This is just a really classic illustration. If you ever learned Illustrator, I feel like isometric art is the 3rd thing that they teach you in class because it's a really easy way to grasp these ideas of color and these ideas of depth. A lot of video games also, Hades uses an isometric view, so does Mario RPG. Like in this example, in a battle situation, you want to be able to see all your characters and all the other characters without worrying about how far away they are. And in this game, with the way the movement works, having it be an isometric view makes a lot of sense, as a lot of times isometric or top-down in games that have a lot of action where you're moving really, really fast across the whole screen. You need to know what the whole room looks like all the time. So that's isometry. Next is atmospheric perspective. This has the least rules. This is literally going for a vibe. So with atmospheric perspective, what you're doing is using the atmosphere that you create in illustration to create depth, usually through this basic idea that things that are far away are blurry. You know, things that are far away are not as clear, they're not as sharp. Especially if you're nearsighted, they adjust things like the value, the saturation, the temperature. So the color of something, if for example, you're in the morning fog, if you've ever looked at SF from this side of the bay, when it's far on a foggy day, the colors feel less saturated. You know, it feels very dark and gloomy. You know, on a sad day, it looks gloomy. And then also the size, obviously, when the Salesforce tower is huge, but from here it looks this big, and I'm grateful for that. So while this applies more often in paintings, you can understand it without as many kind of rules as the other kinds of perspective we've talked about. So all of these paintings, like for example with the Mona Lisa, we all know and love the Mona Lisa. The background is obviously blurrier, so the focus is on this face, the focus is on the figure itself. The background is just there to provide atmosphere. So the colors are cooler, where the face is very warm. The colors in the back are cooler. The shapes are not as pronounced. And the mountains are smaller than her head. They're obviously not actually smaller than her head in real life. And this piece as well, let's look at this one, where you have this sense of color warmth as well, where the foreground is red, and even this tree has a warm tone to it, but the mountains in the back are blue. You know, it has a lot cooler of a color, and it gives you that sense of distance via maybe the actual temperature of this place. It gets cooler as you get higher up in the mountains. It gets cooler as you're further away from the village. Cool. Okay, and with all of those rules in mind, all this kind of information rocking around in your head, 2D and flat art does not really care about any of those. So a lot of the time, vector art and graphic design doesn't really stick to any of those rules because they don't have a need to appear three-dimensional. So in these cases, you know, if you're hiring somebody to make a portrait of somebody, you want it to look really real, so you want to give it a sense of depth. If you're making a video game that needs to have a sense of movement throughout a room, you need to give it depth. It needs to have a reason to feel this perspective. If you're doing, you know, a painting of a lot of people, you want it to actually feel like you're there, so it's realism. But a lot of 2D art doesn't need that. So if you're in a situation, let's say you're making packaging design for some chips, you don't need to really have realism on the chips, or I guess maybe with a picture of the chips. But with the design that you're doing, sometimes the decision you have to make is what kind of perspective or no perspective at all to apply to the illustration. So with this conversation, I just want to hone in on these are skills that I'm providing you, but you don't have to necessarily use them if it's not something that you're interested in. And the most important thing is to evaluate your goal with any kind of illustration. So those are not exhaustive. Experiment. Maybe when you draw something, go with what your gut feels, you know, go with what you think looks right, and then think about going backwards. Why did that look right? Why did that feel right? Why did I size the things I did? Why did I use the colors that I did? So don't be afraid to trust your own judgment as you go through these. Just do what feels right. Trust your gut. Cool. Next is color. I'm going to try to breeze through color before we take our break. Again, there's a lot of content to get through today, so I'll be going through this a little bit quickly. Just as a heads up, we'll finish color and be about halfway there. So color. Color is core to how we see and feel illustrations. Different palettes create a lot of different atmospheres and emotions, and understanding how and when to use what colors is important in making sure you communicate what you want with a given piece of art. And you've probably heard the term color theory 2,000 times, and maybe you've learned it, maybe you haven't. We'll be doing a crash course today on what color theory is. So in design, we've talked about this before in lecture 2. Colors are used to attract attention, create emotions, use your personal schema of meanings, organize similar elements, add aesthetic, any kind of thing. So a wide variety of color use and application is a really important reason why you have to understand color and what you're doing when you have a certain color. So you might have seen color wheels like this before in art class. You've got this classic rainbow going around, and we'll break this down really quick into primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. So primary colors are colors that you can't make from anything else. They're red, yellow, and blue. Just remember that. Primary is red, yellow, blue. This is the painter's palette because when we approach this idea, you make all of the paints out of red, yellow, and blue, black, and white paint. You know, there's not another thing that you can do to make red paint. So that's the basic thing we're going for. You're gonna realize when you go on the internet that people are really angry about this because that's not how digital screens work, blah, blah, blah. But it's the way that our mental model is adapted to understand color. So secondary colors are orange, green, purple. They're a mix of 2 primary colors, and then tertiary colors are anything more complicated than that. So anything like red, orange, blue, green, turquoise, any color name longer than like 6 letters is probably a tertiary color. This is that chart that we saw in the first lecture too, with all these basic ideas about what colors mean. Keep in mind also that this is a very Eurocentric and very American idea of what colors mean. Like if you go to another country and ask them about red, they're probably going to say something different. If you go to another country and ask them about green, they're probably going to say something different. But if you're thinking about the realm of American advertising and American design, a lot of these colors will convey different things, or the same thing to different people. Now, one model of understanding color is hue, saturation, and value. So these are the 3 main components that you can kind of start to understand a color with. Hue is where on the color wheel something sits. So if you're going to call it a name, is it red, is it green, is it yellow, is it blue? Without digging deeper into colors like, oh, it's lavender, oh, it's maroon. Without going to colors like that, think about where on the color wheel it is. Is it red? It's maroon, it's kind of reddish, it's kind of purplish. Saturation is how intensely pigmented a color is. So it's almost like saying like, how red is this? How purple is this? How almost bright is something? So intensely pigmented color, like on this side, is going to appear a certain way. It'll be more neon, more bright, and a less pigmented color is going to feel more pastel, more gloomy. Value is how light or dark a color is. From black is the darkest color and white is the lightest color. And with that, you can start to understand every single color, breaking it down into hue, saturation, and value. So with hue, this is what this slider is in the color picker. So this rainbow slider dictates the hue, and it characterizes basic color. Saturation is left to right. So something to the left is lower saturation, something to the right is higher saturation. And then value is top to bottom. So something on the bottom is lower value, and something on the top is higher value. And again, you can remember that all of the colors with the lowest possible value are black down here. And then the brightest but least saturated color is white, and the brightest but most saturated color is neon. So when you express color, there's a lot of different things you can do, and a lot of the time this depends on the medium. So when you're using Figma, by default it's going to show you RGB because that's the way that screens work for the most part. The pixels have a value of red, green, and blue, and they compose all colors with this red, green, blue value. It's also what's used the most commonly in coding. You're going to use RGB values and hex values the most often. What we just talked about is hue, saturation, value, but it can also be called hue, saturation, lightness, or brightness. Those are a little bit different. We're not going to delve into it. But that's value, lightness, brightness. RGB is red, green, blue. Hex is RGB, but in a different mathematical format. And then another, for example, is CMYK. So if you know, like, for example, NOD, if you've seen hex, RGB, CMYK, it's all the color types. CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and that's how printers function. So with printer ink, they have to break down these colors into a different format, so they use those 4 colors in order to print. It's not in Figma. Figma doesn't have a lot of print support right now, but it also, interestingly enough, has a smaller range of viable colors. So one example of how this can get super annoying is that a lot of bright blues are not translated very well in RGB. So like this really bright blue does not work on CMYK. You don't see this color on like paper or on t-shirts. You see it a lot on digital screens as the blue screen of death color. But because there's like less options when you choose to make colors out of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, you're not always going to see this sometimes. So it's a really important thing if you want to print or if you want to do like clothing design, to keep in mind what color style you're working in. Now, if you want to create a color palette, you can just go to Coolers, which is what I do, or you can start to learn how to make your own palettes. So now that we understand what colors are made of and how they're organized, how do we go about creating cohesive color combinations? And in short, how do we make colors look good? So one thing to note is this idea of temperature. So this is also probably something you've learned about a little bit in school, but some colors are considered warm and some are considered cool. You can think about how your body is affected by those temperatures, and that kind of translates to how your body or your mind is affected by the colors. So warm colors are inviting, they make you feel comfortable. Cool colors are refreshing, they make you chill. So knowing those basic ideas, this basic dichotomy of warm and cool colors, will help you a lot in deciding, what am I trying to convey? If I'm trying to convey energy and fire, you're probably using warmth. If you're trying trying to convey, hey, this is a relaxation thing. Maybe you're going to use a cool color like blue. Especially something to note is that all colors can have a warm or a cool tint or leaning to them. So you can think about something like skin color. Not all skin is the same color, even if we both have beige skin. There's like warm and cool and neutral undertones. It's something that they talk about a lot in makeup, for example. The same goes for black and white. Black and white are a really great spot to have a little bit of warmth or coolness in your work. This is not rendering very well, but this is technically a warmer black, and this is a cooler black, and this is a warmer off-white and a cooler off-white. They seem really obvious here, but if I put them in conversation with the whole piece, it would be less easy to tell that I've adjusted these and they're not pure white or pure black. They'd feel correct because of the temperature of the whole piece. Now, to create a color scheme, this is also basic ideas that we can go through. Complementary colors, they're opposite. So they're often very harsh, they're bold, they maximize contrast and stability. A lot of the time, if you take the brightest color from the two complementary things, it's gonna look really ugly. Like you're gonna get red, green, Christmas. You're gonna get purple, yellow, which a lot of people don't like for some reason. But if you cool those colors down, or tone them down, sorry, not cool them down, by using different ways to make them feel a little more cohesive, like let's match their value. Let's have the saturation be really similar. You can tone it down in a way that makes them feel better. Analogous colors are adjacent, so it's usually where one color is dominant, like for example, red, and then orange and yellow could be the things that follow it and make it feel a little bit more cohesive. Triadic are 3 evenly spaced colors. It's very vibrant, so example is primary colors. If you use red, green, blue, it has this kind of feeling of childishness almost to it, but it requires very careful balance to make sure you're keeping it in check. And then split complementary, this is a little bit more complicated where it's almost complementary, but you've used varying shades to have it feel less aggressive. So if you used red and then you use like teal and like a yellowish green, you'd have split complementary. So here are some examples. Complementary, you've got orange and blue, but again, they're made more cohesive. Like I've used this warmer white, this warmer off-white to make it feel like it's tied together. It gives it a nautical feeling. Analogous colors, they've got green, that ranges from regular green to tealer to yellower. Triadic, this is just straight up red, yellow, blue, and then black and white. This is one of my favorite palettes to use. It's just a lot of fun. And then split complementary, this gives you a lot of like Halloween feelings. You've got, they're just Halloween colors. I don't know how to tell you this. But split complementary is a little bit more kind of tricky to use as well. So if we look at these palettes, something to note is that a lot of them have one property that they keep pretty consistent. So between either hue, saturation, or value, something across this palette brings it a little sense of a unity. So for example, obviously this green palette, they're all green, but they have varying saturation and hue. But because we kept the green consistent, it's a little easier to look at. In this example, they have very similar value. They're all a little bit muted, but they are kind of different saturations, and clearly they're different hues. You've got an orange, you've got a white, you've got a pink, you've got a teal. And then something like this one is a little bit cut off. They have all very similar saturation. They're all very bright colors, but the value and the hue can be different. And also something to note, I get saturation and hue mixed up in my head. I checked these last night to make sure I was saying the right thing. It's okay if you can't like judge something immediately, but there's something about these palettes where there's some sense of cohesion. It's not just random. There's a little bit of effort put into it. So I would say that this guiding principle of let's keep the saturation and or the value pretty similar across all my colors. It'll give you quickly a little bit more cohesive in palettes. So while making those initial palettes is really important, don't be afraid to deviate or make variations on those colors because they can look really different in context with other ones. So in this optical illusion, these two purples look like they're different. This one feels warmer and this one feels cooler, but they are the exact same shade of purple. So keeping an eye on contrast can help in 2 ways. First, maximizing accessibility, just in general, making sure you have high enough contrast in all of your artwork is a good way to make sure that anybody is able to enjoy it. And 2, leveraging this perception of contrast to your advantage for whatever it is that you're working on. Light as well. Again, I'm talking about light a lot today, but there's a lot to know when it comes to colors. So with light, if you've seen the blue, black, white, gold dress meme, you've probably heard a little bit about how this works. But the lighting of an illustration, of a photograph, can alter the way that your brain is perceiving color. So for example, We know all of these have a yellow cube and a white square, or a white sphere, but the actual eye dropped colors are super whack. So in this one, eye drops to like a dark green and a bright blue. In this one, eye drops to like a gold and a brown. In this one, you've got a blue, red, and yellow cube under a really harsh red lamp. Red light is really aggressive, and so the yellow is completely washed out, and the blue just became like straight up black. So if you're drawing something that is in, like, for example, red light or blue light, everything is going to be tinted in a certain way. Everything's going to feel like a different color, but your brain is still processing it because it can abstract away that light source and tell me what the color of something is. So that was color. We're going to take a 2-minute break. There's still a lot to blast through, so we're going to go until 8:01 or so, and then we'll talk about composition and a couple ways to improve in the pen tool and fills. Cool. Okay, I know that was a super short break, got a lot more to get through, so we're gonna go ahead and start again with composition. So you could go and do whole, like, a graduate thesis on composition and how our eyes perceive things differently. I'm gonna give you the 5-minute rundown with a bunch of movie screenshots. So composition refers to the way that elements in a piece are laid out, so the way that they're structured, what is next to what is near what, how do they interact with each other, how do they come together, how do they create dialogue with the way that things are laid out. You know, if I'm looking at this room, there's a sense of like, I can see like people are grouped together in certain ways, people are sitting apart in certain ways, and the way the chairs are laid out, I can communicate like, oh, how are the people in this room before us sitting? So the way that something is composed tells you a lot about the story behind it. So while there's an infinite number of compositions that are good, we're gonna give you some general rules about that, ways to make a composition that works well for you. So the first one is rule of thirds. So you might have heard this before as well. The strategy of rule of thirds is one of the most well-known and kind of easiest to incorporate, because if you have an iPhone, this like thirds panel can show up automatically in order to show you where these intersections of the thirds are. So in short, what you do here is you split a canvas into 9 equal parts by having like a tic-tac-toe board almost over the image. Your eye is naturally drawn to the intersections of those thirds. So your eye is naturally drawn to these particular points. So this person, which I don't actually like this example very much, this particular one on the points, you have the engine of the plane, which is not that interesting. But in this one, you have the horizon line on the bottom third, which breaks up the piece into 2/3 sky, 1/3 like city or land, which is a little bit more interesting of a composition than this one. So dividing parts of a piece into thirds can create like a naturally pleasing layout, because that's just where your eyes want to go. So let's take this dolly piece. In this example, we have this, what is anything that he's painting? This block that is on the left third. We have the sky and the water on the top third. We've got this clock aligned with this particular intersection. We've got this almost aligned with this intersection. You can see how, even though it's not quite perfect, your eye is drawn to the right things, to what he wants you to look at, probably moving here and then moving down and to the right. This is a screenshot from Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. This shot is very deliberately placing them not centered. You know, this shot could have looked pretty good if they were centered, but they're positioned just up and to the right, and your eye is naturally drawn to that particular spot. You've got this crack placed exactly at a third, not quite here, so it isn't as strong as this. It's not taking your attention away from this, but it is placed in a really strategic manner. This is from La La Land. You have this example of her reflection being the one that's on the third line, not her actual person. The actual person is a little bit off to the left, but the reflections, which are what you're supposed to focus at, and maybe there's a lot of, you know, symbolism there and why she's looking at her reflection is not her particularly. But the reality is just a movie shot, and I think it was a panning shot anyway. But this screenshot that whoever uploaded this chose to grab aligns her here because she looks great there. And something else to note is these flowers, they are perfectly center aligned, and they create this mirror in the middle. You know that this center line cannot be crossed. Like if she had put her arm up, it would have felt really deliberate that she was disrupting the line of this mirror. Yeah, rule of thirds in a nutshell. The next is visual triangles. So triangles are a very strong and prominent shape, and they don't also naturally appear super often. They are something that you'll see a lot in like natural composition, where if you look around the room, you can probably spot triangles. But like in nature, you don't see a lot of triangles besides maybe in trees. So visual triangles have a really strong shape, and they create leading lines. So the thing about a triangle is that all two lines are going to lead to a point. They bring you like an arrow into looking at something in particular. So in this piece, you've got this whole composition of everyone is in this line, but not only that, you've got the eye lines bringing you up the triangle. So you see this woman looking up and this man looking down, creating this line that's not actually there. You have the way that the body is positioned in order to create this line. You have the way the arm leads into the body, the way that the legs lead into each other. So in the Mona Lisa, for example, we're going back to her, you have an implicit triangle that even though it bleeds off of the edges, the way she's sitting makes her feel very structured, very stable, very powerful. In this piece, which is not something that I would have spotted on my own, it's just an example that comes up, it has all these triangles. Oh my god, so many triangles going on, with the main fight creating a triangle here, almost ending right here. But the way that it's aligned breaks up the rest of the piece into triangles, and there's probably like papers on this and why your eyes really like this dogfight because of the way that it's composed. Here's Parasite. I made these slides when Parasite came out. I really wanted to include it. And then this is another example where the triangle goes off of the screen. You know, it's not quite in the shot, but you know it's there because you know people have elbows. So in this particular screenshot, you know that her arm is leading you down to the elbow because of the way that her shoulder and her arm are positioned, and those lines of her eye line, which creates the top of the triangle, even though it's not explicitly there, her eyesight points you to the peach, so all of these lines converge on her hand holding the peach. And if we add the rule of thirds here, you would notice that this is basically the top right intersection according to the rule of thirds as well. And as much as I don't like Harry Potter, I'm going to include it here because this had a really, really interesting composition. The illustrations for the covers are incredible. So we've got in this one this really strong triangle that you might not be able to tell because I covered it. His cloak here makes part of the line. The wand makes this really clear line up. His shoulders make the bottom line. Even the way that her kind of headscarf goes is making this point here. In this one, we've got really three strong lines. We've got the wing, we've got the body and the tail of the phoenix, I think. And then we've got this column, which is partially obscured by his body, but you know would lead you there as well. So these really strong triangles also, for example, encapsulate a lot of the important information, which is the title, Chamber of Secrets, and his face. And this one is also encapsulating his face as well as the person behind him, and this guy over here. So the triangles both lead you to the points you're going to, like in this case where the point of the triangle is the most important part, and also what's encapsulated in the triangle can be the most important part. So movement. So even though we're talking mostly today about 2D images, I'm not going to talk about how to make GIFs or movies or anything like that, you can create movement in a still image. So if you think about Van Gogh, one of the ways that he created movement is with brush strokes. So with all these tiny little pieces that you know can lean towards each other, kind of move into each other, almost like a connect the dots. So this really classic piece, Starry Night, you've got this sense of motion from the top here. It moves all the way back up to follow the shape of this black thing that I never learned what it was, the way that the wind is moving almost with the stars, and also just the texture of the oil paint itself gives you a sense of movement. So movement can be really literal, like if I took a photo of somebody running and there's motion blur, clearly them moving. Or you can have something like stroke, like Van Gogh did, or even just Gestalt principles, where you know that something is going to be lined up with something else. So the Great Wave, another really classic example, this is a painting that is still of something that is clearly moving. Water, you know, is going to move. You know, if you're seeing this in real life, a big wave, you know, it's going to come crashing down. In addition to that, you have all the sea foam that kind of kicked up, and you know it's going to come down. Even all of these little ridges of the foam have this claw shape that indicate movement of some kind. And then also, it's rising back up into a wave here as well. This piece from earlier, the dog is walking, the people are walking. You have all these leading lines and even the sense of a sidewalk, like you know movement is happening along the sidewalk. Even though the people are standing vertically, there's a conveyance of like this leading line that, hey, this man over here was probably here earlier. You know, these people who are here right now are going to be here. And then just the way that something is captured, this is a really gorgeous painting where this woman, you know that she can't stand in this position. You know, if you tried to stand in this leaning position, you would fall. So you know that she is in movement. She's going to catch herself. You know, there's a little bit of suspense added to it. There's a little bit of romance in this piece. And then in the back, you have this person clapping. You have these people playing the instruments. You have these women with their arms raised, and just conveys movement really gorgeously, from everything from the light, the way the light is shining on her, to the fabric and the folds of her clothes, to the people playing music, creating something like a soundtrack for her to dance to in the back. Negative space. We've talked about negative space in the context of Gestalt principles, but as you see here, it's also a really easy way to, or not easy necessarily, understand the space that you're working within. So you might be motivated sometimes to draw something first, then maybe decide the canvas size. But if you work within constraints of a canvas, you're able to play with the space that you have going on. So negative space is parts of a canvas where there's a lack of elements. So usually it's going to be black, white, or whatever the color of the background is. So like against this wall, the negative space is the parts of the wall that I can see between the cabinets. So be intentional with negative space. You know, be generous with it. Don't feel like you have to cover every inch of a canvas unless it's what you're going for. Giving room to breathe can make a lot of visual interest. So this poster is so beautiful. It's fire, but in the negative space, you see that it's two people's mouths. So you see the outline of the nose, the lips, and the chin on both sides, and it's just such a gorgeous piece. Cool. So in this piece, there's the clear negative space of the blue here, but there's also this implied negative space of where the piano is not being covered. So in the piano, you see that his arm kind of fades into this negative space. I'm saying negative space a lot, but it creates triangles like we talked about earlier. So just strong shapes that convey a lot of information about the piece. This shot is so gorgeous because there's all this city, all this busyness, all of this things going on in the movie, and you have this moment of peace and this just 1 second of this shot looking so gorgeous with all of the negative space where nothing is in it except for Miles. He's the only thing in the shot, the only thing taking up this space. You see just how much of this shot is just sky. You know, it's like more than half of the shot. Because he's there, it interrupts this whole canvas, it interrupts that blank space and really focuses your attention, just like pinpoint focused on him. So yeah, any questions about composition? That was a lot. Anything you're interested in hearing about? Awesome. Cool. Well, with that, we're going to move into a little bit more of the mechanics of how to do illustrations in Figma. So I've thrown a lot of design theory at you. We're going to go into the pen tool one more time. So this is a recap of those pen tool slides, but I saw some of y'all's messenger stickers. You're doing great. It was so cool to see. So the pen tool, as we talked about, is a shortcut P, and you can access it through the fountain pen icon. When you click the pen tool and you start making a node, it brings you into vector edit mode, which is different from the standard viewing mode. The changes in the toolbar are reflected, and you start creating a vector. Bezier curves are basically paths that have handles on them. So the curve is dictated by the length and the direction of the handle and the way that it's going, and they show as tangential to their respective nodes. And again, we're going to talk about how often you need to add nodes and how to make your curves a little bit smoother. The vector panel up at the top right tells you information, especially this no mirroring or mirror angle and length feature. Again, I'm blasting through these because we talked about it before, but you can know that in order to make a curve feel smoother, one easy trick is to hold Control or Command as you drag out the curves, because it's automatically going to make it mirroring angle and length as opposed to either of the other two. And doing that is going to make your curve feel smooth because there won't be like a really sudden drop in your curve. It'll be very smooth all the way throughout because it's tangential and pulled the same amount. And paint bucket and fill are assigned to the same vector network. So if you want one vector network, it has to share the same fill properties, but you can decide what parts of something are filled in. And make sure that if you want different colors, you have things on separate vectors or layers. Now, your tips for how to make custom vectors that are all your own. It is 8:14 and I am so scared, so we're gonna talk quickly. But when it comes to vectors, there's only a little bit that we can actually teach you in lecture. So I'm gonna give you my hot tips for how to do this, but the only way to actually improve is to do it on your own and see if you feel comfortable with the way the pen tool works. So one key shortcut is this idea of healing nodes. So you might have noticed on straight lines, a phantom node will kind of appear in the center of a line. If you're like me, you probably click on this on accident a lot, or you just make nodes in spots you didn't mean to. You click on like a line and you can't really bring it, make it go away. So there is a way to delete extra nodes without deleting the line. So if you press Shift and then backspace, instead of just backspace when you delete a node, it won't get rid of the line it's attached to, it stays. Whereas if you just backspace it, it's going to delete the whole line attached to it. Healing nodes is just really handy if you're working really quickly and you find that you've done something on accident. But also, it affects curves in a really different way. So when I delete this curve, or when I heal this node, you see that the curve itself is going to change. So it pops in closer and it's no longer dictated by that node, it's only dictated by these. And something I would really recommend is if you feel like your curves are really jittery, go in and try to heal away some of the extra nodes. The longer a particular curve is, the smoother it's going to be. You know, if you have a lot of intersecting handles or you have a lot of really close nodes that are touching each other, it's going to feel more, there's more curves it has to navigate through. There's more like things that you have to eyeball to make them feel the same. But if you're sparser, if you're less generous with the number of nodes you put down, it's going to feel smoother because it can go through from here to here really nicely, as opposed to having here, here, here. It's going to have to go 1, 2. The bend tool is a really easy way to introduce smooth curves from a straight line. So if I want to make this sailboat, you see that I had a straight line, and then I just kind of pulled it down. And the way that I'm doing that is by holding Control or Command while you're in vector edit mode, and then pulling the entire line, not a node, the whole line. It's going to give you that sense of it being bent. So I'll show you really quickly what that looks like. So if I want to make a square, but I want it to be like this, if I want it to look like that, what I can do is go here, I'm holding Command, and I can drag the whole line up. It's going to automatically create those two handles that are aligned with where I clicked. So if I clicked here, you see this one's longer. If I click all the way over here, it's also going to be focused differently. So you can just grab the center and pull it up, and then grab the center and pull it up as well. That gives you a really easy way to make clean, nice, very sexy curves. If you do it against a point also, by the way, it makes new mirrored handles. So if I wanted to make this like a rounded rectangle, I would just go ahead and grab this, and then on the point, hold Command and then drag it out. It's going to make me a nice rounded corner right there. So if you have wobbly lines, like that really iconic Bubbles ice cream, you're going to find that this happens a lot when you start learning how to do vectors. I did this a lot. A lot of my shapes were not smooth, they were very ugly, and often this is the result of having way too many nodes. You know, if you clicked way too many times, your line now has to navigate from here to here to here to here to here instead of just from here to here. So it means that there's all these extra little like road bumps, almost like extra things that are making it difficult to move through. So if you're driving and there's a bunch of little potholes in the road, obviously it's going to be harder to get to. If you're driving a very smooth road with nothing in between, nothing to interrupt you, it's going to be a lot easier. So it can be really easy to want to place nodes at regular intervals. Also, nothing's turned off, I'm so happy. To place nodes at regular intervals, but that doesn't always make the smoothest lines. Instead, you want to place nodes when the curve kind of changes. So in this example, I've cleaned up this to look a lot smoother. And the left has 53 nodes and the right has 34. I didn't do the math. It's like 20 less nodes. But because of this, the vector lines are longer and smoother. We can kind of jump into this example if you want to check it out. So with this one, like for example, if we go into this hair, I added all these extra nodes right here for every curve of the hair, but I really just needed like one here where it starts, one here to communicate this curve instead of having both of these, one to communicate the curve going kind of the other way, and then a final one to end it. So if I were to, for example, like I mentioned earlier, heal away this node, it already feels a little bit cleaner. You know, already that arc is much smoother than what it was earlier if I just heal it away. Cool. Any questions about the pen tool? Especially if there's anything that like you were trying to do but aren't really sure how to do it. I know that like Pathfinder is something that people really miss from Illustrator. There's good workarounds for that, I think, but I haven't touched Illustrator in a while. But yeah, otherwise I will go into fill plus and effects. So we've talked obviously about fill and a little bit about effects, but for the sake of not having to do all this on your own, we're just gonna visualize everything for you really quickly so you know exactly what it looks like. So gradients, by now that you've probably seen how to make gradients if you hadn't made them already, it's a transition of 2 or more colors. It's often also affected by opacity. So if you talked about earlier, that comet illustration used opacity in the gradient. And you can apply gradients to both fills and strokes. So I'm just gonna show you really quickly what all of them look like. Here's a linear gradient. It follows one straight line. You cannot really change, like make it curved or anything, but you can change where it begins and ends, so I can move it up, down, wherever I need it to be. You can add additional colors beyond the 2 initial ones by clicking in this bar. It's not the most intuitive UI, but once you click here, you can drag them along the gradient itself as well. You can also change the direction by dragging these white points. I would just interact and play with everything and just click on as much as possible to make sure that you get it. And if you want to delete something, you want to delete like the green from this gradient, you can just click here and press backspace. Radial gradients begin at the center of a shape and they radiate outward. So in this one, I've got the center going into fully transparent. And this one I have purple and then transparent and then red and then transparent and then red again and then transparent-ish purple. So this type of gradient is best for circles or ellipses or maybe a blob of some kind where you want the edge to feel maybe fuzzy. You can have the end of the kind of radius be see-through. Next is angular gradients, oh my gosh, where they start at one part of a circle and they rotate clockwise. So this has a similar effect to what's going on here, but it affects a circle. Instead of the linear gradient, which would have had it be top to bottom, it goes around the whole thing like a clock. So the colors go in the order you indicate, so I have left to right, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and then I have clockwise, red, orange, yellow, green, blue. And something I've done to make it feel smooth is have the start and the end be the same color, which means the gradient's gonna go all the way back. If they were different colors and this would have a really sharp change right here, I would feel a little bit unnatural. Diamond gradients. I have no idea what the practical use case for a diamond gradient is. I have never figured it out. Why do you need this? It's built into every design tool. But anyway, you can have it emit outward into a diamond shape. It makes a cool sparkle. I have no idea. If you figure out a reason to use a diamond gradient, please let me know. And finally, you can add gradients as color styles, which is great because if you spent 20 minutes like I did making this stupid rainbow gradient, you want to save it so you can use it in the future really easily. So you can set it as a style the same way you'd set a normal style just by clicking in the styles panel. So here I've got the rainbow gradient. I can make, a really long rectangle and then I can apply rainbow gradient to it. Wow, I don't have to do that ever again. So I would highly recommend if you're using a gradient for a project to set it as a style because it's really hard to exactly create. One inherent flaw with this system is that these coordinates are not perfect. There's not a really easy way to lock it into place. You can move it almost like pixel by pixel, but there's not a super great way to recreate it really easily without setting it as a style. So we've briefly discussed effects before, but they're a little bit more pertinent when it comes to illustration. So when you think back to a lot of these, they use a ton of blurs. They use a ton of things like gradients and things like blurs and things like shadows. So just diving one more time into all of these, we can think about how they all work. So a drop shadow is the most straightforward thing. You're making a shadow behind your object, so it's floating, it's kind of off the ground, there's a little bit of depth, again, that idea of perspective, between itself and the surface it's on. So you can have X and Y offset, you can have blur, spread, color, and opacity. Just make sure that you always click this sun icon if you want to change the effect's properties. That's kind of a little bit unintuitive, but you can just go ahead and grab it right here and click the sun icon. The sun is going to be what's changing all these things for you. So I can make it really blurred, I can have it be a really large spreading shadow for some reason. I can change the color to make it like, oh, it's a red shadow now. Do whatever I want with that there. Inner shadow does the opposite thing. So it creates a shadow that goes into the object almost as if it's like indented or depressed. So there's an example of it here in these calculators where there's a sense of depth because something is underneath it right here. So there's a likelihood that they use inner shadow in here somehow to convey that these buttons are underneath these like candy cane shaped objects. So you can have the same properties as the other one, X and Y offset. While this has less UI UX use cases, it makes a really interesting visual effect. Layer blur blurs the layer, it does the edges of it, and it makes it less precise. So it's very fun to play with for things like the soul illustrations you saw. Tons of layer blur going on here. You don't want the sharp edges. And it's also not super accessible. I wouldn't put any text in layer blur. This is just for effect. But there's a lot of interesting things you can do with that. And finally, background blur. This is also, maybe you won't use it as much, but if you want to have a, atmospheric background, you're gonna put a whole layer on top of it and make the information blurred out. So one thing to note is that if you want it to effectively blur the content, you need to set the fill to be less than 100%. Now blend modes, again, super fast. There's a lot of them, and the best way to play with this is just to try it. So what blend modes do is they affect the layers underneath it. So the standard one is going to be pass-through or normal, but if you change it to anything else, it's going to affect it, everything underneath it, all the color and the values underneath it, actually with math. Like when they say multiply, it's literal, like multiplication is happening. And like difference is literally happening. They're subtracting the values of like the red, green, and the blue. So we're gonna start here with pass through 100%. It's gonna be this illustration, but it has a purple rectangle on the right half of it. So if I set this to be pass through 40%, you see this kind of transparent, there's this purple haze over the whole thing. But if I change it to overlay, you see it's become brighter. So the overlay adds a little bit more life to the colors. The saturation is upped. It's all a little bit warmer. So you see that on this phone, the right half of the phone feels warmer black. You see that these two blues are the same blue, but the mouse is a little bit more washed out than the coffee cup. If I change it to multiply, it darkens things a lot because the purple we've selected is actually a pretty dark purple. If we did a lighter color, the effect would be different. You see especially the way that it impacts white and off-white. The white is like almost pink and purple now, like it's straight up not white anymore, where in this case it's still visibly white. Color burn is a little more unconventional, so it's taking kind of the properties and making things like purpler and more aggressive. So you see the most difference in the yellow because the purple and the yellow are very different colors, are opposite ends of the color spectrum, and so the yellow has become really distorted and almost orange, almost burnt here. There is no time for a demo, but I will tell you that if you're interested in this file, I've thrown in some things that you can play with. So like with this one, you can change it to different colors and see like what they do. So if I change this to saturation with a bright red, what's it gonna do? If I change to luminosity with a bright red, what's it gonna do? All of these things are really different. And then we have no time to do this, but I threw in some illustrations I have done in the past that you can like click through. So this is like a watermelon. It's just got a weird ass gradient on it. This is the way the gradient is set up in order to convey the light shining off of it and making it look juicy. That was just a way that I wanted to play with this. I added color burn on the seeds because I wanted them to be darkened, but still match the gradient underneath it. And then this example is, there's a lot happening in here. This is some of the worst file organization I have ever done. It's a little embarrassing, but I want you to see it so you have an idea of what these things might look like. And this, what I basically did was create a plaid pattern through 2,000 rectangles, and then use masking in order to hide the pattern into the shape of the coat. So all these different pieces of the coat. You can see a lot of drop shadows going on in here. You can see a little bit of inner shadow. One of my favorite things I did was with this knit, where there's a layer blur. These are actually just oval shapes laid against the fabric, but with the layer blur, it kind of becomes like fuzzy knitwear. So yeah, play around with that if you want. It's just kind of there as like gratuitous self-insert. Awesome. So we have like no time left. And I want to talk really quickly about, I did not change the freaking slide. So this week's lab and homework is actually very unconventional. Please try to come to this week's lab if you can. If you typically can't make it, if you can try to come this week, that would be great, because this is our actually only collaborative assignment of the semester, both to get you to like work together and also to put a little bit less pressure on it. What you're going to be doing is playing with an avatar design system from Discord and then working together to make a basic composition. We're not going to be grading on the quality of the composition, but it's something that we want you to talk about and work together on. And what you're going to do is create some kind of composition for a food illustration. So each of you will choose a food that you want to draw. So let's say one person wants to draw soda and one person wants to draw pizza. This is a basic composition of like an advertisement for soda and pizza, $2.99 only. Each person for homework, then after the lab, once you've decided on your food, once you've decided on the composition, is going to make 3 variant illustrations of the same basic food. So this is a variant so that you can have a little bit more structure with, say, everything can be basically the same shape. Everything is the same kind of food. So I'm going to draw 3 sodas, or I'm going to draw 3 slices of cake, or I'm going to draw 3 ice creams, or draw 3 fruit. You have the same concept of a variant, so one component that has different states, and then you want to do illustrations for each of those 3 things. Then once you've decided that your illustrations are complete, you just want to pop them back in this file that says maker, and we'll be grading everyone individually, but it'll just be kind of fun to see what everyone comes up with. So yeah, that is this week's lab and homework. They are combined. The secret word for today is going to be watermelon, W-A-T-E-R-M-E-L-O-N. Watermelon is the secret word. And today's announcements, very fast. Again, this is the homework in the lab. Please try to make it. If you can't, please make sure your TA knows ahead of time. If you can't attend the lab, you'll just be doing the assignment on your own. You don't have to worry as much about the maker part of it. Just worry about making 3 variant illustrations. And then make sure that you submit your final proposal no later than Monday, ideally by Friday. Cannot wait to read them. Thank you so much for coming this week. I'll see you next week.